The weight of Owen's small casket settled heavy in Caleb's arms, not just the polished wood and the boy inside, but a crushing, impossible gravity he felt in his chest. His knuckles whitened against the smooth oak as he navigated the slow procession toward the hearse. Bethany was 5,000 miles away, or so he thought, attending some crucial conference in Tokyo. He pictured her in a sleek hotel, far from this gray Ohio autumn. A vibration in his pocket pulled him from the haze. It was a text, an unknown number. "You deserve to know the truth," it read. Attached was a photo. Bethany, laughing, her head resting on a stranger's bare chest by an infinity pool, his arm possessively around her waist. The crisp autumn air held the scent of damp leaves and chrysanthemums, mingling with the faint, sterile smell of the funeral home. Caleb felt each stone of the path under his worn dress shoes, the rhythm of his steps unnaturally slow. Owen's small casket, polished to a dark sheen, rested on his forearms, its weight pressing against his ribs. It was a small box for a small boy, but it felt like he was carrying a universe of lost futures. The impossible gravity wasn't just physical, it rooted deep in his gut, a cold, hard knot. He kept his gaze fixed on the back of the funeral director's charcoal suit, avoiding the blurry faces of the mourners lining the path, each one offering some silent measure of sympathy. His knuckles, bone white, pressed hard into the polished wood. Bethany should have been here, right beside him. 5,000 miles away, she'd said, in Tokyo, closing a deal vital to her career. He remembered her voice, strained but firm, over the phone last week. "I can't reschedule, Caleb. Not for this. Not for this. Not for their son's funeral." The words still echoed in his head, hollow and sharp, now taking on a different, more chilling resonance. As they reached the hearse, the line of greeting extended, hushed whispers and solemn nods. Caleb felt a dull vibration in the pocket of his trousers. Instinctively, he reached for his phone, expecting a work emergency, anything to distract from the surreal ache of the moment. The screen glowed, an unknown number, a text message. "You deserve to know the truth." Below the text, a photo began to load, slowly resolving into clarity. It was Bethany. She was laughing, her head tilted back, a genuine, unburdened laugh he hadn't seen on her face in months. She was by a shimmering infinity pool, azure water stretching out to a distant horizon that looked nothing like the gray, industrial Tokyo skyline she'd described. Her head rested casually, intimately, on the bare, tan chest of a man whose arm was possessively wrapped around her waist. His face wasn't visible, but the closeness, the easy familiarity, hit Caleb like a physical blow. The sun caught the glint of a wedding band on her left hand, a band he recognized as their own. His breath snagged in his throat. The world tilted, the hushed murmurs of the greeting line blurring into a distant hum. He must have frozen because a warm, familiar hand touched his elbow. His mother, sharp-eyed as ever, leaned in. "Caleb, honey, what's wrong?" Her voice was soft, laced with a fresh worry that tore at him. He couldn't speak. The words caught somewhere behind his teeth, choked by a sudden icy rage. He simply turned the phone, wordlessly showing her the screen. Her eyes, usually so kind and steady, widened slightly. Her breath caught, a small gasp. Then her gaze narrowed, a familiar steel entering their depths. "Tokyo conference, my foot," she muttered. The words a low, venomous hiss, just loud enough for him to hear. She took the phone from his trembling hand, her fingers quickly navigating the screen. "Delete it, Caleb, not now. Today is for Owen." She handed it back, her expression stern, unyielding. He nodded, numbly sliding the phone back into his pocket, the glowing screen against his leg, a burning reminder. The funeral director, a man named Mr. Henderson with a perpetual solemn crease in his brow, approached them. "It's time, Mr. Hayes." His voice was soft, practiced. Caleb straightened the small dinosaur tie Owen had picked out himself just a few weeks ago for his school picture day. It was bright green, covered in roaring T-Rexes. Owen had insisted on it, even with his IV pole beside him. A wave of gut-wrenching tenderness washed over Caleb, momentarily eclipsing the burning betrayal. He stood before the assembled faces, a sea of somber eyes, and began to speak. He spoke of Owen's infectious laugh, the one that could brighten the darkest room. He talked about his son's incredible courage during his long illness, his unwavering spirit, and his passion for building intricate Lego cities that sprawled across their living room floor. He spoke of Owen's dreams of being a paleontologist, of digging up ancient giants. He recounted small, perfect memories, each word a shard of glass in his throat. But even as he spoke, his mind flashed to the damning photograph, the vibrant blue of the infinity pool, Bethany's carefree laugh, the stranger's possessive arm. He remembered her exact words, delivered with a practiced apology. "So sorry I can't reschedule. Tokyo's vital for my career, you know that." Her voice, so reasonable, now felt like a cruel deception. He recalled a video call she'd made to Owen just days before he passed, her face pixelated on the screen, a forced cheerfulness in her tone. "Don't worry, buddy. Mommy will bring you a giant Godzilla souvenir from Japan." Owen had brightened, his small, frail body momentarily forgetting its pain, a weak smile gracing his pale lips. Sitting 3 rows back near the aisle were Bethany's parents, Susan and Dale Miller. They looked somber, their faces etched with grief for their grandson. But as Caleb met their eyes, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker crossed Dale's face, a hint of something besides sorrow. He remembered their awkward reassurances about Bethany's unfortunate conference absence, the way they'd avoided his gaze when he'd first called them with the news of Owen's passing. He'd dismissed it then as their own grief, but now a cold dread began to settle in, wrapping around the burning core of anger. He wondered if they too had known. The wind whipped around Caleb's ears, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. He stood alone at the edge of the open grave, the only sound the faint mechanical groan of the lowering device. Owen's small casket, now adorned with a scattering of autumn leaves, descended slowly into the dark rectangle. The finality of the moment pressed down on him, a physical weight in his chest, mirroring the impossible gravity he'd felt earlier. He kept his gaze fixed on the coffin until it rested gently on the floor of the grave, a small, solitary box swallowed by the earth. A few moments later, as the gravediggers began to shovel the first clods of earth, a shadow fell across him. Susan and Dale Miller, Bethany's parents, approached. Susan, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and damp wool, reached for him, pulling him into a soft embrace. Caleb stiffened, enduring the contact, his arms remaining at his sides. He could feel the slight tremor in her hands, or perhaps it was his own. "Such a beautiful service, Caleb," she murmured, her voice a low, practiced condolence. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief, but he noticed her eyes remained dry, clear. Bethany would be so proud. Dale stepped forward, his hand heavy on Caleb's shoulder. His grip was firm, almost bruising, a gesture meant to convey solidarity. "A real shame she couldn't be here, son," Dale said, his voice gruff, steeped in what sounded like genuine sorrow. "That Tokyo conference, it was just unavoidable. You know how these things are." Caleb met their gazes one after the other. He searched their faces, every line, every flicker, every shift in their eyes. He looked for a hint of guilt, a tell that might betray their knowledge. Were they victims, genuinely believing Bethany's lie, or were they participants, complicit in the elaborate deception? He couldn't tell. Their faces were masks, well practiced for grief, or perhaps for something more insidious. "My phone's been off," Caleb heard himself say, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. The bitterness coated his words, thick and unseen. "I'll call her later." The thought of calling her, of hearing her voice, was a fresh wave of nausea. Susan squeezed his arm, her eyes earnest, almost pleading. "Caleb, I know this is hard. Believe me, different people grieve differently. You know Bethany, she needs her space sometimes. Try not to judge her for that." The words were carefully chosen, a subtle deflection. Don't judge. The emphasis on that word hung in the cold air between them, a quiet accusation. He bristled, a slow burn starting in his gut. "I'm not judging anyone, Susan. Just trying to get through today." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a deliberate effort to keep the simmering rage contained. He pulled his arm gently from her grasp. Susan and Dale exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. A silent communication passed between them, a shared understanding that excluded him. Dale cleared his throat. "Look, Caleb, when Bethany gets back, maybe you two should talk about moving forward. This kind of loss, it changes people. Sometimes couples don't survive this, you know? Nothing to be ashamed of if that's the case. The air crackled. Moving forward, don't survive this. The words were veiled, but the meaning was clear. Brutally so. They weren't talking about grief counseling. They were talking about divorce. They were already paving the way, setting the stage, softening the blow for Bethany's inevitable return. A chilling realization settled over Caleb. They weren't just covering for her. They were actively laying the groundwork for her exit. Before Caleb could respond, a formidable presence materialized beside him. It was his mother, her expression a thunderous storm cloud. She clasped his arm protectively. "Patricia, Gerald," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the morbid solemnity. "Thank you so much for coming. Caleb needs to greet some other guests now." Her gaze lingered on them, a silent challenge that brooked no argument. Susan and Dale, caught off guard, murmured their goodbyes and retreated, melting back into the scattering crowd. "Those vultures," his mother whispered, her voice low and fierce, as soon as they were out of earshot. She squeezed his arm, her warmth a small comfort against the encroaching cold. "Did they just suggest divorce?" "Laying groundwork," Caleb muttered, the words raw, tasting of bile. He felt a sickening confirmation, an understanding of the depth of the betrayal that went beyond Bethany. The entire family, it seemed, was in on the lie, or at least prepared to facilitate it. The rest of the day blurred into a sequence of strained smiles, sympathetic hugs, and warm casseroles brought by neighbors. Each story shared about Owen, each memory recounted, was a comfort and a laceration all at once. He moved through the motions, nodding, thanking, his face a careful mask of grief. Inside, though, a maelstrom churned, a violent collision of rage, betrayal, and a profound, aching sorrow for the small boy whose absence now stretched like an empty void before him. The last car finally pulled out of the driveway, its tail lights disappearing down the street into the deepening twilight. Caleb stood on the porch watching it go, the chill autumn air doing little to clear the fog from his mind. He was hollowed out, utterly spent. His mother, her face etched with exhaustion and worry, tried to offer one last comfort, a whispered suggestion that he come with her to the hotel she'd booked. "No, Mom," he'd said, his voice raw. "I need to be here, alone." She'd hesitated, searching his eyes, then nodded slowly, a silent understanding passing between them. He watched her drive away, leaving him in the sudden, oppressive quiet. The house was terrifyingly silent. Not the quiet hum of a house at rest, but a suffocating absence, a void where sound should have been. No muffled cartoons drifting from the living room. No cheerful clatter of Lego bricks being assembled or crashing to the floor. No small, insistent voice calling, "Daddy, come see," from the hallway. And no Bethany. No Bethany who should have been here. A shared grief, a dark, twisted comfort in the empty rooms. Her absence was a physical ache, a phantom limb that throbbed with unacknowledged pain, and now with searing betrayal. He couldn't bring himself to go into Owen's bedroom. Not yet. Not with the silence so loud, the memory so sharp, the anger twisting his gut. Instead, he found himself drawn to Bethany's home office, a space usually off limits to him, filled with her neat stacks of papers, her expensive pens, the faint scent of her floral perfume. He went straight to her desk, a heavy oak piece she'd inherited from her grandmother. He knew she kept a bottle of good single malt hidden in the bottom drawer. For emergencies, she'd always said, with a knowing wink. He needed one now. He pulled open the drawer, the quiet slide of wood on wood echoing in the stillness. Beneath a stack of financial reports and glossy brochures, he spotted it, the dark amber bottle. As he reached for it, his eyes snagged on a folder tucked behind it, a manila folder labeled simply personal. He knew it was where she kept her old journals, her private thoughts she never shared. It was slightly ajar, and the edge of some official-looking paper peeked out, not the creamy, thick paper of her journals. A cold curiosity, colder than any grief, urged him forward. His fingers, still faintly smelling of cemetery earth, trembled as he pulled the folder out. The first document on top made the blood drain from his face. It was an insurance policy amendment. Life insurance. His own policy. Dated 6 weeks prior, almost to the day Owen received his terminal diagnosis. His gaze dropped to the changes. Owen's name crossed out, removed as a beneficiary. Bethany's elegant, looping signature at the bottom, crisp and clear, now looked sinister, a mocking flourish. He felt the nausea rise again, burning his throat. He set the whiskey down, forgotten. His hands were shaking violently now, but he couldn't stop. He pushed past the first document, his eyes scanning, devouring. More papers, a glossy property listing, a beachfront villa, Bali. The image of the infinity pool, Bethany laughing, the stranger's arm flashed in his mind. The price, circled in aggressive red ink, stood out. $875,000. Not Tokyo, not a conference hotel, a bank statement, a large outgoing transfer, $50,000. The recipient, Mark Johnson. The name of the man in the photo he realized with a sickening lurch, the man Bethany was draped over. Then flight itineraries, not Tokyo, not Narita, Denpasar, Bali. Multiple flights. Her departure date matched the one she'd given him for Tokyo. Her return date was vague, open-ended. Indonesian visa applications, filled out, stamped, approved, for Bethany Hayes. And finally, a thick stack of printed emails. They weren't about mergers or market analyses. They were about villa renovations, discussions with local contractors, plans for a wellness retreat, a yoga sanctuary. Bethany's voice, vibrant and excited, leaped from the pages, planning a new life, a new business, a new future. A future that clearly did not include him. A future that most cruelly did not include their son, who was at that very moment resting 6 feet beneath the cold Ohio earth. The house was no longer just silent, it was screaming. The whiskey bottle lay forgotten on Bethany's desk. The amber liquid undisturbed. Caleb's hands, still trembling, reached for his phone. The screen's bright glare felt harsh in the dim office light. He scrolled through his recent messages, finding the unknown number from earlier. His finger hovered over the call button, a mix of apprehension and furious urgency churning in his gut. He knew he was about to step into another kind of wreckage, but he had to. He pressed dial. The phone rang twice, then a click. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered, soft but wary, a slight tremor in her tone. It was a voice Caleb didn't recognize, clear but with an edge of something brittle. "This is Caleb Peterson," he said, his own voice sounding foreign, gravelly. He gripped the phone tighter, the cold plastic digging into his palm. "You sent me a picture today." A beat of silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, the woman's voice, softer now, almost a whisper. "Yes, I'm sorry if it was a shock. I didn't know about your son until afterward. About Owen. I truly didn't." The mention of Owen's name, even from a stranger, sent a fresh pang through him, a reminder of the innocent, crushing loss that now stood at the center of his shattered world. "Who are you?" Caleb asked, cutting through the strained apology. His patience was thin, worn down to a thread. "How do you know Bethany?" Another pause, longer this time. He could hear the faint sound of her breathing, a shallow, hesitant intake of air. "My name is Brenda Johnson," she finally said, the words carefully enunciated, as if she were bracing herself. "I'm Mark's wife. Well, soon-to-be ex-wife, it seems." "Mark Johnson?" Caleb repeated the name, the words echoing with a fresh horror. It was the name from the bank statements, the one who'd received the $50,000 transfer. The pieces were falling into place, each one a sharp, jagged edge. "The man in the photo, with my wife." "Yes," Brenda confirmed, her voice laced with a raw, weary resignation. "I'm sorry. They've been seeing each other for nearly a year now." A year, the words hung in the air, cold and stark. Caleb's mind reeled back, tracing the timeline. A year. That was when Owen's symptoms had first started. Vague at first, then increasingly aggressive. That was when their family's nightmare had begun. When he'd thrown himself into doctor's appointments, endless research, a desperate search for answers, for hope. While he'd been fighting for his son's life, while their world had been crumbling, Bethany had been starting an affair, building a new life, brick by sickening brick, with another man. It was almost too much to comprehend. "How did you find me?" Caleb asked. the question mechanical, almost an afterthought, but still crucial. He needed to understand the mechanics of this intricate, devastating betrayal. Mark isn't as clever as he thinks he is, Brenda said, a dry, bitter laugh escaping her lips. He left his email logged in on our home computer. I saw messages, first about a Bali trip, then more. Emails between them, discussing plans, future plans, her plans for a yoga retreat, the villa renovations, all of it. Her voice was tight, the controlled emotion barely masking a deep well of pain. She paused, then continued, her voice gaining a new chilling tone. Then I saw a message. Something Bethany had written to him, complaining about how draining things were at home, about her obligations. It mentioned your son's condition, Caleb, in passing, almost like an inconvenience. I was horrified. Caleb closed his eyes, leaning heavily against the desk. Horrified. The word barely scratched the surface of what he felt, what he had been feeling, what he was just now beginning to feel as the full, ugly truth unfurled before him. He had known betrayal. He had felt grief so profound it had threatened to drown him. But this was a calculated cruelty, a callousness that defied understanding. Brenda Johnson, a stranger, was a voice from another wreckage, another life shattered by the same storm. And in her words, Caleb found a strange, unwelcome kinship. The silence on the line stretched for a long moment, filled with the unspoken shock of shared discovery. Caleb stared at the documents spread across Bethany's desk, the insurance amendment, the Bali villa listing, the bank transfers. The whiskey bottle sat untouched, its promises of oblivion now distant and irrelevant. His mind raced, connecting the dots, each one a sharp, painful jab. He had to tell her. He had to speak it aloud to give shape to the monstrous outline forming in his head. There's more, Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of any discernible emotion, even to his own ears. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold, slick surface of the insurance policy amendment. He could feel Brenda listening, her breath shallow on the other end of the line. I think they were planning to use Owen's life insurance money to fund their new life. There's a form here, removing him from the policy. It was signed just weeks ago, right when his prognosis became definite. A sharp, audible gasp came from Brenda. Oh God, she whispered, the sound a ragged exhalation. That tracks with what I found. It perfectly tracks. Her voice was tight, a barely contained fury simmering beneath the surface. Mark took out a massive loan against our house without my knowledge. A second mortgage. He forged my signature on some of the documents, I think. I only found out when the bank statements started arriving. Caleb pictured the Bali villa, the circled price, the $50,000 transfer. It was all aligning, a meticulously constructed plot of greed and heartlessness. What did he say when you confronted him? He spun some story, Brenda continued, her voice hardening with each word. Said it was an investment, a huge opportunity in a property overseas with his business partner. He mentioned they just needed a bit more capital to make it happen. Something about a final tranche of funds, some last-minute liquidity needed to close the deal. From our son's insurance policy, Caleb finished, the words like cold steel. The implication hung in the air, grotesque and undeniable. Owen's death wasn't just an unfortunate event that cleared the path for Bethany's new life. It was a financial transaction, a planned funding mechanism. He thought of Owen, small and brave, fighting for every breath, while his mother and her lover plotted their escape, their future built on his absence. Caleb, Brenda said, her voice dropping, taking on a new, serious tone. There's something else you should know. This is going to be hard to hear, but I think your in-laws might be involved. Caleb's hand, which had been resting on the pile of documents, froze. The air grew heavy again, thick with unspoken complicity. His mother's whispered warning, those vultures, echoed in his mind. The quick glances between Susan and Dale at the cemetery, their carefully chosen words about moving forward. It all twisted into a knot of sickening realization. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, afraid of the answer, yet desperate to hear it. Brenda took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. The emails I found, she began, they weren't just between Mark and Bethany. There were others. Between Mark and Susan and Dale Miller, your wife's parents, they were discussing the Bali plans. Not just vaguely either. Specifics. The cost of renovations, the timeline for the purchase, the logistics of getting money transferred. They were involved, Caleb. Deeply involved. The betrayal now stretched further, encompassing more than just his wife and her lover. It included her parents, the people who had claimed to mourn their grandson alongside him, the people who had offered him hollow platitudes of comfort while secretly, it seemed, facilitating his wife's escape and profiting from his son's death. The image of Susan's dry eyes, her forced embrace, Dale's heavy hand on his shoulder, it all coalesced into a chilling tableau of deceit. How many people knew? How many people had looked him in the eye today, knowing the truth, knowing the monstrous plan, and remained silent? He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a profound loneliness settling deep within him. Brenda's voice, now a steady counterpoint to the chaos in his mind, continued to weave the threads of the conspiracy together, her own pain a mirror to his. Life's choices, he realized, were often costly. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The phone felt heavy in Caleb's hand, a direct line to a truth he hadn't known he was seeking. Brenda's words hung in the quiet office, stark and unforgiving, painting a picture of calculated cruelty that extended beyond his wife, his in-laws. The thought alone was an ice pick to his heart. He'd always believed in the sanctity of family, the unspoken bonds that held people together through hardship. Now that belief was shattering, piece by agonizing piece. "My in-laws?" Caleb asked, the words barely a whisper. Disbelief warred with a sickening certainty in his gut. Susan and Dale knew? All of it? "Yes," Brenda confirmed, her voice now steady, almost calm, as if relaying facts from a police report. From the emails, it's clear they were explicitly discussing the villa, the renovation cost, the timeline, and they kept talking about how the seed money for the retreat would be secured soon. They even offered advice on how to handle the transfer, suggesting different banks, ways to avoid scrutiny. Seed money, Caleb breathed, the phrase a chilling echo of his earlier thought. It clicked into place with horrifying precision. Owen's policy, that's what they meant. The life insurance payout, his son's death, reduced to mere capital for a yoga retreat in Bali. Brenda continued, her voice growing colder. They were actively advising Mark and Bethany, helping them iron out financial details, anticipating potential obstacles. Mark even mentioned in one email how clever Bethany's folks were, helping them concoct the Tokyo conference story. He bragged about how good they were at covering tracks. Caleb closed his eyes, picturing Susan's defensive tone at the funeral, her dry, unseeing tears. Dale's heavy hand on his shoulder, his gruff insistence that the Tokyo conference was unavoidable. Their subtle, almost insidious push for him and Bethany to move on if their marriage didn't survive the grief. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't misplaced sympathy. It was carefully orchestrated manipulation, a well-rehearsed act to ease Bethany's escape and their own complicity. The full weight of the betrayal settled upon Caleb now, a crushing burden that went far beyond the infidelity itself. It wasn't just his wife who had betrayed him. It was the entire family he had married into. The people who had watched Owen fight for his life, who had sat with them in hospital waiting rooms, who had smiled at Owen and told him he was brave. These were the people who had then looked him in the eye at their son's funeral, offered hollow condolences, and hugged him, all while complicit in a grotesque scheme involving his dying child's future. It was a depth of cruelty that felt truly Midwestern in its quiet, insidious horror, a betrayal hidden beneath a veneer of polite concern. A cold, unyielding resolve began to harden within Caleb. The grief was still there, a constant, aching presence, but now it was tempered by something else, something sharp and dangerous. The shock had given way to anger, and the anger was slowly coalescing into a singular, unwavering purpose. The Midwestern quiet he usually cherished, the calm, unassuming nature of his home, now felt like a shroud for these monstrous secrets, a silent witness to a profound, unforgivable injustice. "Thank you, Brenda," Caleb said, his voice flat, but underneath a tremor of determination, solid as steel, had begun to form. Thank you for telling me. He hung up the phone, the receiver heavy in his hand. He looked at the papers spread across Bethany's desk, the insurance form, the Bali property listing, the emails from her parents. The house was no longer silent. It hummed with a different kind of energy now. It was the dawning of an inescapable reckoning, a truth so stark it demanded action. Caleb stood amidst the scattered papers on Bethany's desk, the phone still heavy in his hand. The truth, stark and brutal, had finally fully revealed itself. It wasn't just Bethany's affair or her calculated absence from Owen's funeral. It was a cold, deliberate conspiracy orchestrated by his wife, her lover, and most sickeningly, her own parents, Susan and Dale Miller. Owen's life, his illness, his death, all had been factored into their plans, a grotesque financial equation to fund a new life in Bali. The house, once a sanctuary of family noise and laughter, was now a tomb of secrets, its quiet depths reverberating with the weight of his discoveries. The raw grief for Owen, still a fresh wound, now intertwined with a cold-hard resolve. Caleb was no longer just a grieving father. He was a man who knew the full extent of a calculated betrayal. The comforting, familiar calm of his Midwestern life had shattered, replaced by an inner storm of grim determination. He looked down at Owen's dinosaur tie, still clutched in his hand. The reckoning, he knew, was just beginning.